If you want to open up your Bibles with me, we're going to dive into Psalm 49 tonight. Psalm 49. The first verse of Psalm 49 here, it says, "For the music director, a psalm of the sons of Korah." So once again, we see the sons of Korah that have been writing a lot of these psalms. The first part of Psalms, it was more often penned by David, and now we've got the sons of Korah. And they say, "Hear this, all peoples. Listen, all inhabitants of the world, both low and high, rich and poor, together." So to start with, who is the intended audience of this psalm? Who's this psalm meant for?
It says all the peoples.
All peoples, right? Not just some peoples, not just Israel. This is all peoples, right? So it's meant for all peoples. And it gets a little bit more specific too. What kinds of peoples?
Rich, poor, low, high, everybody.
Everybody. Right, yeah. So not just all peoples, which you could conceivably take that to mean nationalities, right? Different countries. But he goes on to specify that this is of all statuses as well. High and low, rich and poor. So you can be wealthy, you can be poor, you can be anywhere in between. This is for everyone. This psalm is meant to be heard and listened to by everyone. And then the next two verses we find out a little bit more. He says, "My mouth will speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart will be understanding. I will incline my ear to a proverb. I will express my riddle on the heart." So some psalms are for praise, as we've seen, and some are for lament, some are for thanksgiving. Based on verses 3 and 4 here, what is going to be the general message of this psalm? What do you think? Information, okay. Wisdom? Yeah. This is for teaching, right? This is for wisdom and understanding. So this psalm is structured a little bit more like perhaps one of the Proverbs is. It's meant to be taught, to be meditated on. It's meant to teach you something. He says in verse 4, "I will incline my ear to a proverb." This is what you're meant to do. You're meant to listen to this proverb. And the author here, he says, "I will express my riddle on the heart." Now, if you're reading out of the King James Version, it'll say, my dark saying, right? That kind of sounds ominous. But in the NASB here, it says riddle, which I think is what it's going for. The idea of dark saying is just something that's not illuminated. It's a saying that is maybe parts of it are hidden. That's what a riddle is, right? So he's going to explain this mystery to us. He's going to explain this riddle. And so the next few verses here, verses 5 and 6, he says, "Why should I fear in days of adversity when the injustice of those who betray me surrounds me? Those who trust in their wealth and boast in the abundance of their riches." So the psalmist asks a question. Why should I worry in times of trouble when I am surrounded by the iniquity of those who trust in money? Right? Does that sound to you like he's asking you for a specific answer, or does it sound a little bit more rhetorical? What do you think? Rhetorical, right? Kind of sounds like he's going to tell you the answer here, right? Yeah, and the implication here also seems to be that the psalmist is speaking when he says times of trouble. Based on what he's saying afterwards, it sounds like he's talking about times of money trouble specifically, right? Times of money trouble when maybe you have just a little bit, but perhaps worldly people have a lot. That's kind of the impression that I get here, based off of what he's said so far and also what he's going to say as well. Did anybody have a different impression than that? Okay, that's good. So, verses 7 to 9. He says, "No one can by any means redeem another, or give God a ransom for him. For the redemption of his soul is priceless, and he should cease imagining forever, that he might live on eternally, that he might not undergo decay." So the psalmist here reveals a truth about redemption. This is a spiritual truth that he's revealing here. And what is it? What is this thing that he reveals to us about redemption?
A great price has to be paid for it. It is costly.
Yeah, redemption's costly.
And I can't explain it.
Okay.
Well, I could.
No, redemption is costly, right? But who can pay that price? It's a costly price to be redeemed. Who can pay that?
Christ paid it for us.
Christ paid it for us. Kim?
The value of our soul is priceless.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now he says, the psalmist says that no one by any means can redeem someone else, right? So that means that if you sin, I can't pay that off for you in some way, right? Nor can you do that for me. I can't go to God and say, well, my friend sinned, so here's this huge donation or perhaps this huge sacrifice, for you to forgive them, right? I can't buy their redemption with physical money. I can't do that, right? It says, no one by any means can redeem someone else. But Addie just mentioned that Christ redeemed us, right? Well, how's that possible? Because he's someone else and he redeemed us by some means. So how's that all work?
His sacrifice is himself redeemed us. He bought us with a great price.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Pat, I think I saw you have your hand up too.
Yeah, I was going to say that he redeemed us with his blood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you get the idea here that since we know by the rest of the Bible, of course, that Jesus can and did redeem us, that what he's talking about here is humanity. There's no other human being that can redeem us. And when he talks about means, again, this is talking about earthly wealth and things when it goes along with the rest of the psalm here and what he's talking about. So in other words, one man can't buy redemption for another. So if you sin, I can't buy your way out of that, and vice versa. We can't use money to get each other out of that, right? Only God can forgive sin, right? And that was, again, through Jesus that was made possible for everyone. Now that part in the middle there, between verses, specifically in verse 8, he says, "For the redemption of his soul is priceless, and he should cease imagining forever." What's he getting at when he says he should cease imagining forever? What's he trying to tell us there? That's maybe a way that we might not word things today. So what is he saying there? Does anyone want to take a stab at paraphrasing that? Kim?
Maybe if you live forever and ever, like if we were eternal, that maybe we could eventually have enough money.
Maybe? I don't think that's what he's going for, because he's saying it's priceless, right? The way that I read this is that in verse 7 he's saying you can't buy redemption for someone else, and then he kind of takes a little aside and explains why, because your soul is priceless, so you can't afford to buy that. And when he says, and he should cease imagining forever, it's kind of like, a soul is priceless, there's no way you can ever pay that off, so you quit trying to think of a way that you could do that, or quit trying to think that maybe that's a possibility, right? Just stop entertaining that idea. It's not even possible. So cease imagining forever. And then he kind of goes back to what he was saying. For the redemption of his, or only God can pay a ransom for him that he might live eternally, right? So it's only God that can do that. And again, like we said earlier, God did that through Jesus, right? So that we may live on eternally that we might not undergo decay. And again, as you're thinking towards Christ and the fact that he was raised up and he did not undergo decay, that should come to mind as well. Pat?
I was thinking of two denominations that do exactly what, you say we can't do.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Catholics trying to pray and pay money to get people out of purgatory after they die.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is the Mormons. They believe that somebody that's passed on and is not a Mormon, that they can be baptized for them to save them after
Mhm.
they die. So
Yeah.
strange.
Yeah, and we see right here that's not a possibility, right? There's no way that we're able to save someone else, that we're able to redeem them. That's not possible. Now, of course, we can spread the gospel, right? We can tell someone what the path to redemption is. We can lay out the steps for them, but you can't make them take it, right? You can't do that for them. It's only God that is able to forgive them, right? So the psalmist is explaining this very real truth to us, and again, this is in the Old Testament that this is being explained to us, and we see how this is fulfilled with Jesus coming. So we can kind of, again, it's one of those connections between the Old and the New Testament that I like so much because it shows the whole story here. So verse 10, it says, "For he sees that even wise people die. The foolish and the stupid alike perish and leave their wealth to others." So, who does death come for here, then, in this example? Everybody, right? Everybody. You can be wise and you can't escape death, right? You can be foolish and stupid and you can't escape death. And basically, he goes on a little bit about the foolish and the stupid along with the wise, and they all leave their wealth to others. Again, this psalm, you should get the impression by now, this is dealing a lot with wealth, right? Because back at the beginning of the psalm, it's talking about times of trouble, specifically money trouble, and how you shouldn't be agitated about it. And this whole psalm is meant to kind of explain why here, right? So, you can't redeem somebody else with money. Everyone's going to pass away at some point. And it says that when you do pass away, what happens to your wealth?
Somebody else spends it.
Somebody else spends it, right? You can't take it with you.
That's the reason I don't have any.
Yeah, you know, it's left behind for others. There's nothing you can do about that. And when we get to the book of Ecclesiastes, the author there talks about that as well. Of course, there are lots of places in the Bible that deal with talking about physical wealth, of course. But there are other passages that have similar sentiments where, you know, it doesn't make sense to hoard up wealth here because you can't take it. And even if you are good with your money in this life and you leave a great inheritance to those you care about, maybe they don't spend it wisely, you know, or maybe they're not even the ones that end up with it. It could be someone who fools or tricks them out of it, and then it's gone anyway, right? So it's all left behind. You can't take it with you, is what the psalmist is saying. Verse 11, he says, "Their inner thought," again, talking about people who want to hoard up their wealth. He says, "Their inner thought is that their houses are forever, and that their dwelling places to all generations. They have named their lands after their own names," right? So, again, when we kind of touched on this a little bit, but what do many people think in their heart about their wealth? That it's forever, right? It's going to last forever in some way, shape, or form, right? He gives some examples of ways that it will last, right? He says that they'll be remembered by their lands or their houses, right? You might build this, maybe it comes to mind Solomon's house, right? Solomon built this great and wonderful house. It's like this wonder. Well, maybe you build this amazing structure and you think that it's going to be a monument to your name forever, or people have lands that are named after their own names. That was a common practice and still is. And maybe that'll, my possessions will in some way keep my memory when I'm gone. Well, that might be true for a time, right? That might persist for time. But houses get torn down and rebuilt. Lands get renamed or divided up, right? So these things aren't going to last forever. And even if they make it hundreds or thousands of years, eventually everything will pass away, right? When Judgment Day happens, everything's going to go. So what people think about wealth in their inner heart, that it's going to last forever, is in fact wrong, right? Your wealth's not going to last. So, verses 12 to 14. He says, "But a man in his splendor will not endure." That's what we just said, right? He is like the animals that perish. This is the way of those who are foolish, and those after them who approve of their words. Like sheep, they sink down to Sheol. Death will be their shepherd, and the upright will rule over them in the morning. And their form shall be for Sheol to consume, so that they have no lofty home. Okay? So we already talked about this. What is the reality for all people in wealth is that it perishes, right? You're going to pass away at some point, and your wealth is not going to last, right? That's kind of what he's going after here. And he says it in a very flowery way, right? For all those who think about that, it says, you're not going to endure. You're like animals that perish. Like, they don't have a lot of possessions, and they just pass away. Right? It says, this is the way of the foolish, and those after them that approve of their words, right? So not just the foolish, but those who come after them, who approved of their ideas. And then 14 is a much more poetic verse, but essentially it's saying that they're all going down to the grave, right? Again, this is just a poetic way of showing that physical wealth is not going to last. But then the psalmist goes on. He says, "But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me." So now we're given a contrast. Okay, there's all these people who care about wealth, but now what's the psalmist put forward as a different path? What's his idea? Rather than trust in physical wealth, what does he recommend?
God.
Be spiritually redeemed.
God, being spiritually redeemed. Right. He says God will redeem him. Remember, another man can't redeem you. You can't buy your salvation, but God will redeem you. And so that's what he's trusting in. God will redeem you from the power of Sheol, the power of the grave, for he will receive me. So we do have a path towards eternal life. We don't have to be all doom and gloom here. There is hope. God will redeem us. So then he says in verse 16, he says, "Do not be afraid when a person becomes rich, when the splendor of his house is increased." Okay, so now we're going back to what we said earlier, right? He said, why should I worry in times of trouble? Why should I worry about those who surround me that have all this wealth, right? Now we're going back to that. And he's telling us, again, why should you worry about that, right? Don't be afraid when a person becomes rich and the splendor of his house is increased, right? We don't need to worry about that. And based on his message so far, why is that? Why do we not have to worry about that?
Wealth will not save your soul.
Right. Wealth won't save your soul.
We're talking about redeeming our brother if we have wealth. Well, wealth itself will not save you, nor me.
Exactly.
I don't care how wealthy you are, money, you won't buy your way into heaven.
Right. We shouldn't worry about who's wealthy or not, because wealth isn't going to get you anywhere in the end. You can't take it with you. You might have on earth a reward, right? Going on to verse 17, it says, "For when he dies, he will take nothing with him. His wealth will not descend after him. Though while he lives, he congratulates himself, and though people praise you when you do well for yourself," right? So he's saying, on earth, right, if you do become wealthy, you might congratulate yourself, like, I did good. I earned a great living. I've got a great savings. I've got a great retirement. Whatever that may be, I have an inheritance laid aside. And people might praise you for that. Like, look how successful you are. You did everything right, You're one of the 30 under 30, right? Something like that. You've made it. People will praise you for that. And while there are things to be said for good hard work in this life, the psalmist here is definitely getting after the idea that, again, wealth is temporary and wealth is passing. And you can't put your faith and trust in that. Because even if you do well in this life, again, that's not going to help you eternally. He says in verse 19, he says, he will go to the generation of his fathers. They will never see the light. Mankind in its splendor, yet without understanding, is like the animals that perish. Right? So he will go to the generation of his fathers. And what does that mean? You go to the grave, right? The people who went on before you, they die, right? And then you're going to go to the same place. And it says, and they will never see the light. So here there's not hope, right? If you've placed your faith and trust in wealth, then you're not going to see the light. And to kind of sum everything up, the psalmist ends with verse 20. And that's really what he's using to sum it up. He says, mankind in its splendor, so you've got all this physical wealth, yet without understanding, you don't understand spiritual matters, is what he's saying, is like the animals that perish. You're no smarter than an animal. You've done no better off for yourself than an animal if you don't have that spiritual understanding. That wealth does not help you. Now, I think it's worth pointing out here that it's not saying that having wealth in this life is necessarily bad, right? Having wealth doesn't get you condemned. It's just not going to help you get to heaven, is what he's trying to say.
And it
Right?
could keep you out of heaven.
Yeah, it could, right? But we have encountered rich men in the Bible who are good, right? Job was a great example. Abraham had a lot of wealth, right? There were others that also had a lot of wealth, but they had spiritual understanding, and that was what they put ahead of those wealthy things. The wealth was more of a blessing because of how they were walking with God, right? So overall, again, the message here, I think, that the psalmist is getting at, if we want to turn to the New Testament, I think it's summed up well in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 21. He says, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. We've read a lot of Psalms recently, and I think that this one is a really good one for us, especially because our society puts so much emphasis on physical wealth. It's really important, right? What you do and where your career goes and how much you've made by 20 and how much you've made by 30 and how much you've made by 40 and how much of a retirement do you have put away and all of these things. So everyone is so obsessed and cares so much about money, right? This is a good reminder for everyone because that constant pressure can wear on us. Even though we come to church and we study the Bible, it's easy for those pressures to have an effect on us. Said another way, if you think about Lot, when Lot lived in Sodom, right, it weighed heavy on him, the environment he was in, right? That has an effect on you even if you know what's right and wrong. Those things can pressure you daily. The same can be true of us. We can be easily influenced by the outside world, even if we understand what's right and wrong. And so having these reminders and things to reflect on is always good for us. I know that we we have eternal treasures, and that's better than physical wealth. And that should be Bible school level of knowledge, right? But somehow as adults, we seem to forget that from time to time. So it's great to have these things. Pat?
I think Jesus said it very well in Matthew 16:26, where it says, "For what does it profit a man?"
Yeah, and there are so many times that, again, not just in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, people, specifically Jesus, spoke about wealth, right? Because so many people care about wealth. And even in this verse here that we just read, Jesus is kind of pointing out, you should have treasures. Just have the right kind of treasures, right? Don't put your trust in these physical treasures here on earth. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, right? What kind of treasure do you want to have? Because that's where your heart's going to be also. So yeah, it's very important. So we'll stop there for tonight. That's the end of that Psalm 49. Now, this coming week, we're not going to have a study in Psalms. We'll have to wait for the following week because we have our gospel meeting. And also remember that it's a slightly different shift in when we meet, right? We're not going to meet quite at the same time. It's the gospel meeting hours. So keep that in mind as well. So thank you, everyone.
In a moment, we'll sing that 315, Oh, Why Not Tonight? But I was thinking about the book of Esther, of all things. It's kind of an interesting book. I have a lot of questions about the book of Esther. It's in this weird time where, the people are in captivity, and there's this, this strange arranged marriage that Esther, the Jewish woman, gets caught up in that kind of seems like, well, that's not right that should be doing that, but of course she's kind of forced to do that, and all these questions. But nevertheless, where she finds herself in the book of Esther, by the time we get to chapter 4, there's this plot in the politics of the kingdom there to kill all the Jewish people, and so her relative or uncle or whatever, Mordecai, he learns about that, and of course all the Jewish people kind of learn about that, but it seems like maybe Esther isn't aware, being isolated there, and he lets her know. And there in Esther chapter 4, it says at the beginning, now Mordecai came to know all that had been done, and he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out in the midst of the city and cried out loudly and bitterly, and he went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth, because he's mourning and wearing the sackcloth. Now, in each and every province where the word and law of the king reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many made their bed in sackcloth and ashes, because there was this date set that they're going to be annihilated. And so that's certainly bad news. Verse 4, then Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. So now Esther's learned of this terrible news. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and remove his sackcloth from upon him. Stop mourning, get dressed in something nice. It seems to be the idea, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs. And so then there's this messenger thing that goes back and forth, where they pass these messages where Mordecai's out there mourning and Esther seems to be in the castle, so to speak. Back and forth about the situation, and Mordecai is appealing to her, hey, go before the king, because you have a special place where you're able to do that. I can't do that, and nobody else really has the influence that you have. And, you're actually a Jewish person in the kingdom, sort of secretly. They didn't realize that. So you're perfectly suited to do this task. And seems to be some hesitation there. In verse 9, then Hathach came back and told Mordecai's words to Esther, and Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to reply, all the king's servants and people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come before the king for these 30 days. So she's indicating there's this risk. I can't just go to the king and say whatever I want, because by default I will be killed. But he can choose to, have mercy, but that's sort of like the by default killed part is sort of concerning. Verse 13. Then Mordecai said for them to respond to Esther, because of course this messenger tag game, telephone game here. Do not imagine that you in the king's house can escape any more than all the Jews. You're just because you're there in the castle, you're not protected because you're a Jewish woman, and you'll be found out as well. Verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not reached royalty for such a time as this. And that's kind of the coolest verse in the book, I think, is this deal. One thing that's said about this book is that God's name God isn't really mentioned directly here, but he seems to be kind of indirectly mentioned here. Because who knows whether you have not reached royalty for such a time as this. In other words, God has caused things to work out in such a way, behind the scenes, for you to be in the place so that you can glorify God by saving the people, right? And of course she goes on to do that, and there's a period of fasting, and in verse 16 she decides, I'm going to do that, and if I perish, I perish. Just kind of decides, that's how it might be. And a great courage we see in Esther. And I guess the reason I was thinking about relating this to the invitation, not so much we need to obey the gospel. I think everyone here has obeyed the gospel, but just thinking about us as Christians and as lights in the world, we're put here for such a time as this. Each of you, each of us, in our families, and in our neighborhoods, and in our workplaces, and whatever social situations we find ourselves, you're there and I'm not there, and vice versa for each of us. Each of us has a unique situation, and are we using that to the glory of God, to share about the gospel meaning, to share about the gospel in general, to invite folks to church, to invite folks just to be in our lives and be kind to them so that we can have a good relationship and be able to, over time, get them closer to God. And so just wanted to challenge us to think about that. Each of us are put here for such a time as this. And if anyone needs to obey the gospel, there's a night for this, and that's right now. Today is the day of salvation. So if there's anything you need to change in your life, we encourage you to do so as we stand and sing the song.